In CSS, there's another type of selector that you're going to want to know how to use because you use it all the time, and it would be good for me to show you how to do that. So go ahead and create a new file, and we're actually going to call this one grouping and grouping.html and copy descendant.html, and we're going to paste the exact same thing because we're going to work with that same HTML. Just change the title to grouping selectors, and then you already have your style sheet hooked in and all the rest of the cool stuff there. Now, what we're going to do before we get started, because I want to show you another trick that's outside of the grouping selector lecture here, but I just want to show you this because I think it's about time. So I'm just going to expand this window just to show you. Currently, the boxes, they span the full width of the browser. And as you probably know, there are a lot of websites that have their content, the container content, within the center of the browser. Let's say, for example, I don't know, let's go to my website here. Now you can see here that this content here in the center doesn't actually span the full width. It takes up most of the width, but it's centered within the middle of the browser. This whole container here is centered within the middle of the browser. Now there are elements that are full width, like this header and the background and the footer, but the main content is centered within the browser. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this lecture as well with the content here. So first, I want you, before we even get into grouping selectors, is just wrap all of the boxes, the primary and secondary boxes, in another div. And this is where divs are handy. This is where you would want to use, this is a great example of using a div. I'm going to wrap all that in a div, and I'm going to give it the ID of main container, and I'm going to use camel case there. And this is a good example of where I would use a comment to say and main container, and maybe I'll put a pound sign there to show that it's an ID. So this is a good example of using the comment there because there are a lot of divs here that are closing. And I mean, luckily in brackets, you could see, you know, it highlights the pairing, the matching div. However, in not all browsers, code editors do that. So this is a good idea just for your own visual cue that, hey, this is the end of that div. Tabbing is also a reason why you do that. So you could see that this matches up with this div. Anyway, so we have main container. Now it's wrapping all the content. Save that. Now we're going to go into our CSS. And at the bottom here, we're going to add another comment and say styles for the grouping selector lecture. Let's jump into what grouping selectors are, and then I'll come back to centering this content afterwards. A grouping selector is essentially selecting multiple elements that aren't, it's not a descendant selector, like this is a descendant selector, this is a descendant selector, but a grouping selector is if you want to select this whole element and this whole thing, whether it was a descendant selector or just a plain HTML element or an attribute, so on and so forth. It just lets you select multiple different elements using the grouping selector. So here is a good example of a grouping selector. I'm going to select the primary box, and using a comma and a space, I'm going to select the secondary box. That is a very simple, straightforward example of a grouping selector. So now I've selected both of those, and I can give them both a style. So this will style both of them, and this is the reason why you use this is for efficiency purposes. So instead of giving, let's say you wanted to do, here's a good example, primary box, let's say you wanted to say margin, let's go 30 pixels on the top and bottom and 20 pixels on the left and right, so you could differentiate. So you could see I'm styling the primary box there, but what if I also wanted the secondary box to have the exact same styles? I would say margin, 30 pixels, 20 pixels. So now they have the same styles, but this is inefficient because I'm using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines in my CSS style sheet to generate one style for these elements here. And that's even worse if you wanted to if you had a, say, a third box, or you were styling the H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 all in separate lines, and then you gave them all the same style. That's just a waste of space. So this is where using a grouping selector is handy, because all you got to do is just group that in there with this selector, and now you could just remove this second line. It has the same styles. So that's how you use a grouping selector. Another good example would be if you wanted to select, instead of selecting the level 1 heading, the level 2 heading, the level 3 heading, so on and so forth, all you got to do is separate them by comma. So now I'm selecting all the level headings, H1 through H6, and let's say I want them to be text align center, and I want all of them to have a border, bottom, solid, 3 pixels, red. And let's say also padding 0 on the top, 0 on the left and right, and 10 pixels on the bottom. Let's space it out a bit. So there you go. You can see now I selected all of these. So if I were to add a level 6 heading anywhere in this page, it would adopt those styles because I grouped it in here. And what I could have done, this could have been horrific how much space this would have taken up on my sheet, my style sheet. I could have had a level 1 selector and then these styles, a level 2 selector, then these styles, level 3, these styles, 4, 5, 6, and I could have taken up all of this space and wasted precious style sheet space, but also you would have made the style sheet actually a larger file size and slowed down loading time by a very small amount, but still it's the principle of the thing. It's bad practice to waste so much space when you could be more efficient. And so that is a grouping selector. Let me just show you another example just for fun. We can, let's say in the primary box, we also wanted to add a div, give it the class of inside box. And in here, I'm just going to add a level 5 heading and say this is an inside box. And some just paragraph here and say, and now I'm going to copy this and paste it in all of the boxes. This is the secondary box, the other primary box, and the last secondary box. So now you can see the inside box has a level 5 heading, and it also is centered with the line, the red border on the bottom. And now why don't we just style that just to look a little bit nicer. We're going to add a style here called the secondary box, and we'll say border, solid, 1 pixel, black. Sorry, that's not secondary box, that is inside box. So there's our inside box, and you can see the inside box in these boxes here. Obviously, you can't see the black border inside the box here, but you get the idea. And so yes, this is a grouping selector. You separate it by comma, and that is simply all you have to do. And you can group any amount of selectors together. You can have an infinite number of them, and they're incredibly useful when you're trying to efficiently style a number of different elements using the same styles rather than splitting them out on a lot of different, a lot of separate lines. And so that's it for the grouping selectors. Now, before I go, I'm going to show you what I did promise just a little bit back, how to center the content in the middle of the browser. So you can see this is just full width, and it doesn't look very good. We want to center that in the center of the browser. So we just need to select, and I'm just going to put it in the grouping selectors section here just because it's part of this lecture. It has nothing to do with grouping selector, but it's just a part of this lecture so we can keep organized. We need to select that main container ID, and all you have to do is set a width. So I'm going to say width 960 pixels because that's kind of a standard width for websites when you're doing web design. And so we have a 960 width here, but we are no longer centered at all. And the way we do that is by giving the margin of the container 0 on the top and bottom, or you could do 20 on the top and bottom. That's not the point. I'm just going to say 0. The trick is having the left and right margin be auto. So this just says margin on 0 on the top and bottom, and auto, this is the trick, means it will automatically calculate the left and right margin to be the same. So it gives the center content, or the content, to be centered in the middle of the browser, no matter how wide or how small the browser. Unless you go smaller than the 960 fixed width. But you can see it's centered in the middle of the browser, and you can now see how you can start developing your website and coding it so that your CSS puts your content in the center of the browser.